with the presentation now. So today's talk, I'm going to be giving a presentation on how to create habitat for bats, why they are such wonderful creatures, and why I'm so passionate about them, and why I think that they're just wonderful. So I might skip some slides in this presentation, just depending on time. I hope to get through all the slides if possible, but just as a little bit of forewarning. So in today's presentation, we're going to be talking about kind of 4 different things. We're going to first start with the benefits of bats and a lot of the misconceptions that surround them. Then some of the threats that they are facing, especially to our local species, about the ecology of our local species, and how you can help them from home. So I'm really passionate about bats, and one of the reasons why I love bats so much is that they're just so diverse. I mean, when most people think about bats, they generally imagine like a mouse with wings, but really bats come in all sorts of different colors and have all sorts of traits and really cool behaviors. They're a really unique group of animals that most people just don't really know about. So one of the ways that I like to introduce bats to people, rather than just me rattling off facts and information, is I usually like to start off with a little true or false game. This is just a kind of a nice way of making some of these basics about bats, in a little bit more of a fun fashion. So in this game, don't worry if you don't know the answer, just guess from home. You can type it up in the chat if you want, but you don't have to. A lot of it, I think a lot of you will probably know a lot of the answers already, but it's just kind of a nice way of getting started. So my first true or false question addresses the common saying, blind as a bat. So kind of guessing from context, do you think it's true or false that bats are blind and that they like to fly into people's hair? Many of you probably already know this answer, and others who do not might be able to guess just based on the theme of my presentation. And it's all right if you don't get the answer right, but this one is absolutely false. This is actually one of the most common myths that surround bats, is that they are blind, and all bats can see. In fact, many bats don't even have the ability to echolocate, which is where they're sending out sound waves and listening to the echoes. But all bats can see. Some can see really well, while others have okay eyesight. But all of them can see, and trust me, they don't want to be in your hair any more than you do. So they're quite agile, so they're not really getting into your hair. All right, so the next question is true or false? Without bats, there'd be no bananas or tequila. Some of you are probably thinking that this is an oddly specific question about bats, and that the question is that specific and must be true, and you would be right. When most people think about pollinators, most people imagine bees and butterflies and hummingbirds and lots of other critters like this. But what a lot of people don't know is that bats are actually good pollinators too. There's over 700 species worldwide of plants that rely on bats. And while this isn't as high as it is for like bees or butterflies, a lot of the plants they pollinate are things that we really like. For example, the wild banana, from which we've gotten our domestic banana from, depends on bats for pollination, as does agaves, from which we get tequila. So if we didn't have bats, there'd be no tequila, which is another reason why I personally love bats. And they're also great seed dispersers too, because lots of bats eat fruit. And so then let's go into the next question though. So true or false, bats are flying mice? Again, probably a lot of you know the answer to this already. Others might not know, and if you don't know, that's perfectly fine. You can give a guess if you want. There's no problem if you don't get it right. But this one is absolutely false. And this is actually one of kind of my pet peeves, is when people think of bats as flying rats. They are not rats, they're not rodents. We're actually more closely related to mice than bats are. Bats are kind of their own kind of weird little evolutionary branch. They're not really closely related to everything, but if you had to pick a closest relative, it would actually be dogs and whales and other critters like that. So, oh, sorry, one more question. And then true or false. This one is actually kind of tricky, but it's, can a single bat eat 1,000 bugs in an hour? This picture is kind of deceptive because that moth in it is about the size of that bat's head. So it's kind of hard to imagine that they could eat 1,000 bugs in an hour. But remarkably, this one is actually true. Bats have really high metabolisms and they have to eat a lot of food to stay alive, which makes them really important in our natural ecosystems for controlling insect populations. Because they do eat so many insects and they help to keep these populations level. And in particular, here in Central Texas, they eat about 1,000 tons of insects every night, which is just incredible. And the really nice thing about this is that most of the insects that they're eating are agricultural pests. There are bugs that eat corn, cotton, and pecans, and other crops like that. So bats are actually really important for our agricultural system. And they also help to reduce disease risk from mosquitoes. So bats clearly have lots of important roles, and there are a lot of reasons to love bats. But unfortunately, bats are in decline basically worldwide. Bats may be found on every continent except Antarctica, but in every continent, they are declining fast. They're declining faster than lots of other animals. And a large part of this is due to their low birth rate. So bats are a lot like people. So unlike animals like dogs and cats, which reproduce really quickly and have large litters with lots of babies every year, most bats only have one pup every year, which is fairly unusual, but they have very long lives. But this means that they're very sensitive to impacts. So if somebody was to go in and throw dynamite in a cave with 1 million bats, it's going to take a very, very long time for that population to recover. So it's very easy for bat populations to decline quickly, but not so easy to grow them back up. And that's one reason why bats really need our help. And unfortunately, there are a lot of threats that are facing bats right now. Habitat destruction is one of the big threats. There's also something called white nose syndrome, which I will get into in a minute, as well as persecution is another big one. Persecution is especially big right now due to our global pandemic. The rise of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 is largely the result of our exploitation of nature. Basically, destroying natural habitat, taking animals and sticking them into inhumane conditions where they're all congregated together and in close contact with people. This is really a lot of the rise of these diseases that are jumping from animals into people is largely due to our own unhealthy relationship with nature. And unfortunately, a lot of people are persecuting and killing bats worldwide because of it. But that's really I'm not really going to talk much about persecution right now because the theme of our talk is going to be on how to create habitat, which is something that we can all do to kind of help bats. So why do we need to restore habitat for bats? What are some of the reasons why habitat is so critical? Well, one of the reasons is to counteract something called white nose syndrome. Many of you have probably heard of white nose syndrome. A lot of you probably have not heard of white nose syndrome. Honestly, while it's a really big problem right now, it hasn't been very well reported in the news, especially right now. So what is white nose syndrome? White nose syndrome, oh sorry, I don't have it in presentation mode, that's my bad. So white nose syndrome is a fungus that came from Europe or Asia. It only affects bats, it does not affect people. You cannot get white nose syndrome. But in a nutshell, it's basically like a deadly form of athlete's foot, for those of you who know what that is. Basically, it's just a really itchy fungus. So what it does is it gets on bats, and it's so itchy that it basically prevents bats from hibernating during the winter. So hibernation is that state where bats kind of go dormant. They basically shut down their metabolism so that they're no longer burning energy. And they do that because there's no food during the winter. At least not within most of the United States where it's really cold and there are no insects flying around. So bats do this to save energy. But when they have white nose syndrome, because they're so itchy, they really can't hibernate and they end up starving to death. And it doesn't affect all species, but it does affect many species, especially our smaller bats. And it's caused basically a 95 to 99% mortality rate for many of these species. And so we're basically losing bats throughout much of the United States. So many of you might be wondering, okay, what does disease have to do with habitat? Well, we can't exactly tell. Although white nose syndrome is very easy to treat, we can't really go out and capture every bat. Bats are really bad about showing up for doctor's appointments. Let me just tell you that now. So we can't physically treat every bat in the United States for it. And so what we have to do instead is to allow bats to overcome the disease themselves, to develop disease resistance, which is already starting to appear in some populations, but we need to help bolster their populations until they can develop enough disease resistance. Research has shown that bats that are fat have a greater chance of surviving white nose syndrome. And this makes sense. This is a disease that causes them to starve to death. So if they can go into hibernation, into winter with more fat reserves, more emergency reserves, then they have a much better chance of surviving to the end of winter. And how do we make bats fatter and healthier? By providing more habitat and by providing better quality habitat. And so that's why I'm especially right now focusing so much on creating habitat for bats. Places for them to, and by habitat, I mean places for them to live, places for them to forage and eat, and basically make a living. So habitat is key for several reasons. To help them survive white nose syndrome, to really help them to overcome habitat destruction, because we have come in and we have really destroyed most of their native habitat throughout the United States and in Texas. So whatever we can do to help offset those impacts will have benefits on bats and on other wildlife. So I'll get into how to create habitat in a few minutes, but first let's review our local species of bats. Because before we can create habitats for them, we need to know who it is that we're helping and what their needs are. So we have about 8 species of bats that live here in Bexar County. There's a few others that are kind of rare here, but I'm going to focus on these 8 resident species. And we generally have 2 types of bats. We have cave-dwelling bats and we have tree-dwelling bats. I'm going to start with cave-dwelling bats here. So the first one is the Mexican freetail. These guys are our most iconic species. They're our state flying mammal, and they're the ones that most people are familiar with. Like the big bat colony under Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin is composed of Mexican freetails, males, more specifically. The females don't usually live under the bridge. It's mostly males. And these guys are so cool. And I also really love their kind of piggy-like snouts too. They're really great. But so these guys primarily live in caves, especially the females. During the summer, the females head into caves to give birth. Each female has 1 pup each. And while the males, the useless males, and they are kind of useless, when they're courting the females, they actually dance and they actually sing. They warble like a warbler, like a bird, like songbirds. And they have this really pretty mating routine, but once the business is over, they leave the females to do all the hard work of rearing pups and whatnot. So they're kind of useless, but we love them anyways. They're very lovable. And it's males that usually go and live under bridges and in parking garages and stuff like that. So Mexican freetails are definitely our most abundant bat species that we have around here. If you're seeing bats flying around at dusk, they're probably Mexican freetails. And thankfully, they are not sensitive to white nose syndrome. Only 2 of our local bat species are actually vulnerable to white nose syndrome, which I'm thankful for. And we'll get into those 2 species in a couple minutes. So these guys, they do not hibernate, so they don't have to worry about white nose syndrome. So these guys, perhaps the most important consideration habitat-wise for them is to have unobstructed roots. These guys are wicked fast. In fact, these guys are actually the fastest flying animals in powered flight on the planet. The peregrine falcons can technically beat them, but peregrine falcons cheat. They dive. They're using gravity. These guys can fly at almost 100 miles per hour in straight powered flight, no tailwind, just based on their own abilities, and which is just mind-blowingly cool. So these guys are really superstars of the animal kingdom. But while they're really fast, they're not as agile, and they don't really want to be weaving through trees and bushes and buildings and stuff like that. So these guys need to have enough room in order to, especially when they're leaving their roost, in order to really get up into the air and get going. So these guys are open air foragers. They generally are foraging above the canopies of trees or above prairies or water, you know, sometimes upwards of 10,000 feet into the air. And so they're not directly interacting with landscapes in the same way that our other bats do, but they still need native landscapes. So these guys largely eat agricultural pests like cotton ball worms and corn earworm moths and stuff like that, which actually those are two same things. But anyways, so these guys are largely eating agricultural pests, but agricultural pests aren't around the whole year. When most of these agricultural pest species of insects are only really common during the growing season of crops. And so once the crops are done, these bats still need food. And so they still need natural habitats like forests and prairies to produce the insects that they need to eat. So although they're not directly interacting with prairies or forests and other habitats, they still need these habitats to exist. So the next bat is one that most of you have probably not heard of, and this one is called the cave Myotis. So these guys are small bats. These guys are very dependent on caves to a greater extent than Mexican freetails. They primarily live in caves. Sometimes they'll live in old buildings, which are like caves, but not very commonly. So these guys can be locally common around here. Again, they're not as abundant as Mexican freetails, but they're fairly common bat. Generally, you find them, because they are dependent on caves, you generally find them in areas that have caves around them. They can travel very far from caves each night, so you don't have to be right next to a cave to find these guys. You can be in a suburban area and find these guys foraging over your garden, just as long as there's a cave in your general vicinity, a cave that is suitable for them. Because most caves are not suitable for bats, actually. Bats are very picky about where they'll live. So these guys are unfortunately very vulnerable to white nose syndrome. Although they have not been hit by white nose syndrome yet, that's only because the disease has not yet reached their population. But once it does, within these next couple years, we expect cave Myotis populations to really crash badly. And so this is a species that we are really trying to help right now. They're very understudied. There's not much known about cave Myotis, and so this is a species that of conservation concern right now. So these guys, as far as their foraging habitat goes, they're pretty flexible. They'll use open areas, but they especially like forests. These guys are very agile. They're very maneuverable. They like getting really close to vegetation, like the canopies of trees. They often forage around the crowns of trees and stuff like that, picking off insects. All right. Next one is called Peter's Ghost-Faced Bat, and isn't this such a cool looking bat? I mean, they look so funky, they look so weird, and they look a little bit intimidating, but don't worry, they're not gonna fly off with your children. These guys are small, and so they might look scary, but they're very harmless. And I'm not gonna talk about these guys very much. Although they are residents of Bexar County, they're only found on a few parcels of private land in the county. You're not gonna find these guys at your local park or in your backyard or anything like that. So there's not much we can do about them. I just wanted to kind of introduce them real quick. All right, so now let's move into our tree-dwelling bats. So these are our bats that are living up in the trees, in our forests, stuff like that. So you're not gonna find these guys in caves. And so the first one is the eastern red bat. And isn't this a gorgeous bat? Not all bats are brown and plain looking. These guys are red, some of them very vibrantly red, and have all these cool, they just look really cool in general. So these guys, you're generally going to find roosting up in the canopies of trees. They really prefer broadleaf trees like oak trees, cedar elms, hackberries, stuff like that, especially oaks. They generally pretend to be dead leaves, and they're almost impossible to spot. So these guys are fairly common. They're very common farther east. Once you get into the eastern United States, this is one of the most common bats in the eastern United States. Around here, they're not as common, but you can still find them in forests, in parks, and stuff like that, mostly along trails. So these guys are forest dwelling, but they don't like too much clutter. And by clutter, I mean lots of vegetation all over the place. So they really like to have a well-developed canopy, but then have it kind of open down below so that they can really fly among trees very easily. They don't want to be swerving too much. These guys especially like to forage along the edges of forests and woodlands. And if you want to find them, you can sometimes find them foraging around street lamps, picking off moths and other insects attracted to the light. And thankfully, most of the tree-dwelling bats are not vulnerable to white nose syndrome, so which is good. It's mostly cave-dwelling bats that are sensitive. All right, so the next tree-dwelling bat is the northern yellow bat. These guys are a little bit pickier about where they will live. So these guys generally live in dead palm fronds and in Spanish moss. And they will sometimes use oak trees like red bats. But dead palm fronds are really kind of their favorite. So if you have a large stable palm, I'd really recommend leaving the palms up there, the dead fronds up there, because not only do yellow bats love them, but lots of birds and other things love to be up in the fronds. So these guys are, although they're tree-dwelling bats, they don't really like foraging in forests. They don't really like woodlands that much. They really like prairies and foraging over water. So they really like having open areas, especially native prairies with lots of wildflowers and native grasses and stuff like that. They're really common up in northern Bexar County where you have prairies available. You're not going to find them in areas that are too thick with trees. Most of San Antonio has too much forest cover for yellow bats. They really need grasslands and lots of open water to really be great, but they are actually pretty common where habitat is available. So the next one is the evening bat. Now this is probably one of the plainest looking bats that we have around here. I still love them. They're cool bats. There's not very much known about evening bats. Not very many people have studied evening bats. We don't really know much about their ecology. We don't know much about their behavior. There's just not much known about them. So these guys are different than the other tree-dwelling bats that I've talked about in that you're not going to find them in the canopies of trees among leaves. These guys like to stay more hidden. So they're generally under tree bark or in tree hollows. They don't really care what tree they're using. It could be a conifer, it could be a broadleaf like an oak. They don't really care just so much as there are little crevices for them to fit into. And they're actually fairly uncommon, which is kind of strange because they're very flexible in their foraging habits. Like they're known to forage over agricultural fields where they eat a lot of crop pests. They're known to forage within open forests, so they don't like too much clutter. They're not as clutter tolerant as, say, the cave Myotis that we talked about earlier, but they will forage inside of open forests. They'll forage along woodland edges. You know, they may visit suburban areas. You know, they're pretty flexible about their foraging habits, but they're not very common around here, which is very strange. And there's another bat called the big brown bat, which is super common all across the United States. And they're a big generalist. They'll use almost any habitat, but they're also rare here in central Texas. So something about our area just isn't very conducive to bat generalists. So let's move on to perhaps the most stunning bat that we have around here, and that's the Hoary Bat. And just look at all the colors in that bat. They have silver and gray and tan and brown and black and just all these colors. They're really beautiful bats, and they're also our largest bat. These guys you can usually identify by sight just because they're much bigger than any other bat that we have around here. And these guys are also tree dwelling, but they're different than the red bats that while red bats really like oaks and trees like that, these guys really like conifer trees. So these guys are more common farther east where you get into the pine forests of East Texas and stuff like that. But we also actually have quite a few of them here in Central Texas. They will use mature juniper too, I suspect at least. They will use oak trees too. You know, they will use broadleaf trees. It's just not their preference. When possible, they prefer to use conifers. And so I generally find these guys more in northern Bexar County where we get into mature junipers. Not the short shrubby junipers. They need old junipers, ones that are tall and have enough moisture to actually get to a sizable size. And in particular, they like to roost in trees that are unusually tall and wide, taller than surrounding trees and kind of near clearings. That way, when they decide to drop down to go foraging, they can just swoop into an open clearing and that they're not having to dodge through trees and worry about hitting one like George of the Jungle. So in general, these guys are uncommon throughout most of their range, and you're not going to find too many of these guys in San Antonio proper, within most of San Antonio. You're mostly going to find these guys where there's more tall conifers. Now, a lot of them do migrate through during the spring and fall because these guys are migratory, although we do have some that stay here. So as far as habitat goes, these guys generally fly over the canopies of trees or open prairie, above prairie. So they're not going to be going through trees. They're not going to be in the forest like a lot of other bats are. They're going to be flying over everything. All right, and then the last bat is the tricolored bat. And these guys actually use both caves and trees, which is why I have them at the end. So in the winter, they hibernate in caves. And then during the summer, many of them move out to dwell in trees and under bridges and stuff like that. And when they do live in trees, they like to be up in oak foliage in particular. So they're like red bats. They like the foliage of oak trees. These guys are absolutely vulnerable to white nose syndrome. And while they're still locally common here, that's only because white nose syndrome is only, the fungus that causes it is only just now gotten into Bexar County. And we expect to see the disease appearing pretty quickly. So their populations have not yet declined here, but in the eastern United States, where white nose syndrome has been around for a few years, these guys have absolutely crashed. So this is one of the species that's really hammered hard by white nose syndrome. And so this is the other bat species of really conservation concern that we have around here. So these guys are definitely our most maneuverable bat. They're very good flyers. They're not fast, they're very slow. While the Mexican freetail can fly at 100 miles per hour, basically, these guys are more like 10. I don't actually know the exact speed, but you can usually identify them on sight because they're so slow and they're very fluttery. They really look like a moth, actually, like an unusually large moth. They're not much bigger than a moth, to be honest. So these guys I generally find in areas with lots of vegetation. So one good place to find them is in some of the dark corners of Brackenridge Park, which can be kind of scary at night, but if you want to find tricolored bats, that's one place where I've found tricolored bats before. They really kind of like riparian areas or old growth areas that have lots of types of habitat structures. So they like having areas that have open areas, but then also cluttered areas. They like to have this diversity. They're definitely our most vegetation loving bat that we have around here, and they can tolerate more shrubs and bushes than other bats. So we also have several rare bats around here, which I'm not going to really talk about because I don't really have time, but some of them are really cool, like the pallid bat, which hunts centipedes and scorpions, and silver-haired bats, which are just beautiful. So if you want to know more about how to find out what bats you have around your area, you can ask me about this later. I don't really have time in this presentation to talk about bat watching, but there are many ways to do it, either visually or through technology. So now let's get onto our main topic of how do we create habitat for bats. And there's kind of 7 ways that I put down. We're mostly going to be talking about water, native plants, and providing shelter for bats. I might talk about bat-friendly products just very, very quickly at the end if I have time. So let's talk first about water. Or no, first I want to mention that before we even get into water, I'd like to mention that if you have a few acres of land, there's a lot you can do to help bats. But even if all you have is a small backyard or even just the balcony of an apartment, there are still ways you can help bats by providing native plants for them. And I'll get into that. First, let's talk about water. So providing water for bats, that's something that you need to have a little bit of space in order to do. The best approach is to build a pond, something with sloped sides that they can get out of if they fall in. But even if you have a swimming pool or a trough or something like that, that can help too. There are several requirements for it to be useful. Bats can't use your ordinary old bird bath, unfortunately. Bats need an actual large source of water. So they normally need something that's at least 10 feet long in order for them to be able to safely use it. And honestly, the bigger, the better. That's kind of the lower limit on the size. And it also has to be free of obstruction. So you don't want to have like hidden rocks underneath the water surface that they're going to break their jaw on when they swoop down to get water. So it should be clear of obstructions both in the water and along the sides of the water source. And they should have some way to escape if they fall in. So if you don't have a pond, say you have a swimming pool or some other source of water like that with steep sides, buy a frog log. Frog log is a commercial product that allows you, that is designed for frogs in mind, but other wildlife will use it too. Small wildlife at least. A javelina can't climb out of it using it, but a bat or a frog can. And we can see it down, a picture down there. It's basically just a ramp, an escape ramp that allows them to get out. You can also build your own escape ramp if you want. Just whatever you can do to help them escape. So now let's get into native plants. Why do bats need native plants? After all, it's not like the bats that we have around here are fruit eating or nectar drinking. There are tons of fruit eating bats throughout the world, and there are lots of nectar drinking bats, but these don't live in central Texas. They live a little farther south and a little farther west of us. All of our bats that we have around here eat insects, so why do we need native plants if they're not directly using them? Well, it's because bats need insects, but it's the insects that need native plants. So over the last 30 years, there has been a roughly 80% decline in the number of insects worldwide. This varies by region, but in general, although we don't know the exact decline of insects here in central Texas, we know that they have declined greatly. And any great decrease in insects is a great decrease in food for bats and for songbirds and other wildlife. And so if we want to help bats, we need to help insects. And insects need three things: host plants, nectar plants, and shelter. So what is a host plant? A host plant is a plant upon which an organism lodges and subsists, with emphasis on that last word, subsist. So even things like butterflies, even though butterflies drink nectar, most of them, you can't have any butterflies without their larvae, without caterpillars, which eat the actual foliage of plants. And so in order for us to have, and that's the same for other insects too, beetles, true bugs, etc. They all need to eat plants in order to mature and become food for bats, as well as being cool in themselves. And with a few exceptions, our insects only eat native plants. So a garden full of exotic plants from other countries and continents, it's basically useless for wildlife. And so the key is to plant a diversity of native species and not using pesticides, because using pesticides defeats the purpose. And that said, not all plants are created equal when it comes to their ability to support, to produce insects. For example, among trees like oak trees produce a ton more insects than things like Yopon hollies. Even though they're both native, oaks produce a lot more insects. That said, oaks are already super common in the landscape, so I'd really recommend planting other great native plants that are not as common, like our native plums and cherries, like black cherry, or willows and aspens. There are lots of other plants that are really good for producing insects that are not as common. And so National Wildlife Federation has a great resource for choosing the best plants for producing insects. as well as I have a suggested plant list, which you can get. We'll add a link that you can download it from our website, or you can email me directly if you want a copy. It has lots of great examples of native plants. So let's talk about nectar plants. So nectar plants are primarily for moths who greatly prefer nectar from native plants. Generally, if you want to attract moths, usually flowers that are pale and fragrant are the best, especially if there are lots of little flowers like rusty blackhaw, which I have a picture of here. And you should have enough plants to produce year-round nectar availability. So get plants that bloom at different times of the year. A few good examples include a Yanaqua tree and Mexican plum. They both produce white flowers. Frostweed is a great herb, is a great herbaceous plant that produces white flowers and is a critical nectar plant. And then we also need to provide shelter for insects too. So this is moving on to the next need. So we're out of native plants now. So in a nutshell, have an untidy yard. Be a lazy gardener. Leave leaves on the ground. Leave dead wood. Leave stems from plants from last year. You know, basically leave things messy. And you'll be providing lodging and shelter for insects. And if possible, avoid lawns. It's not always possible. I understand some people need to have lawns either for HOA reasons or whatnot. But if you are going to have a lawn, please use a native lawn composed of buffalo grass. So there are examples of this like Thunder Turf and Habiturf are good ways of this, and they support more wildlife than traditional St. Augustine lawns. If possible, have garden beds everywhere, or restore a prairie. Having a prairie or a forest is ideal. So I don't really have time to talk about this next little section. This is on vegetation structure, which by structure, I mean just the spatial arrangement of plants. Basically, the main point I want to make here is that, as we have reviewed, different bat species like different things. So some bats like it open, like our yellow bats like prairie, whereas tricolored bats like thicker forests or open forest. And then you have some bats that are in between, like red bats and hoary bats, which like it kind of in between. And so there's when you're trying to restore habitat for bats, it's sometimes useful to help think about what bats are going to benefit from this and which ones are not. And same thing, and it's not just about bats, you know, it's also about other wildlife too. For example, most bats don't like shrubs. Most of them like it to be pretty open underneath, but there are, say, songbirds like wrens that absolutely need shrubs and dense areas. So the best advice I can give you is just to have a diversity of habitat. So if you have the land, it isn't really applicable to you if you have a small backyard, in which case do gardening for bats. This is mostly for people with a couple acres of land. Try to have a diversity, so don't just have forest, have some thicker woodland, have some more open forest, have some prairie. Try to have diversity of stuff. So now let's talk about our last section, our last really talking point, and that is shelter. So bat populations are really limited by their access to suitable shelter, which is seasonally different. So bats have different needs in the winter than they do in the summer, for example, and it's different between males and female bats too. In general, there's not much we can do for most cave-dwelling bats unless you are Mr. Bamberger and can afford to build your own artificial bat cave. For the most part, most of us can do more to help tree-dwelling bats. That's what we'll really talk about. So this is kind of somewhat review from what we talked about earlier, but first I'd like to just kind of review what different bats need. So red bats really like to be in the foliage of hardwood trees like oaks. Same thing with tricolored bats. Whereas hoary bats like conifers, then you have bats that live in palm fronds like yellow bats, and you have bats that live under bark or in cavities like evening bats and silver-haired bats. I didn't really talk about silver-haired bats, but we do have some of them. They are sometimes in Bear County. But that said, not all trees are equally suitable as roosting trees. Most tree-dwelling bats like trees that are larger and that are just larger than surrounding trees. So having like a big heritage live oak surrounded by smaller trees is usually very attractive to bats. Also, having a big tree that is near the edge of a clearing is also usually preferred. And of course, if you really want to help bats, leave dead trees up if safe to do so. It's probably not an understatement to say that it's probably safe to say that trees may be more useful for wildlife dead than they are alive. And that sounds very counterintuitive, but in reality, when a tree dies, it becomes a haven for insects. Lots of insects are attracted to it, lots of insects start eating it, and this produces lots of food for bats and birds and other wildlife. And not only that, but lots of crevices and hollows and cavities open up, which provide lots of roosting opportunities for bats and other wildlife to use. Dead trees are a natural part of the landscape. In fact, if you go through a forest and don't see dead trees, that means that it's not healthy. It's being overmanaged, and it's not very good. It's not ideal for wildlife. It's not always safe to retain dead trees. Like, you don't want a dead tree by a sidewalk or by a house or anywhere where if it fell, it could cause damage or injury. And so but if you have land and have like a dead trees just like in the middle of it, I'd recommend leaving them up. And if you have invasive trees that are not good for wildlife, like China berries, I like to girdle them, which is making an incision around them, which basically kills them but leaves them standing. And that actually turns them from a nuisance for wildlife into shelter for wildlife. And so again, this is something that is mostly relevant for people with land, more so than people with just a small backyard. And lastly, I like to talk about bat houses or bat boxes, which is shelter. And so in general, if you had to choose between leaving a dead tree up or putting up a bat house, go for the dead tree 10 out of 10 times. You know, bat houses are no substitute for natural shelter. A bat box may last 20, 30 years before it decays to the point of being unusable. Whereas if you have a forest, that's going to provide shelter for bats in perpetuity, forever, basically, as long as it is protected. And so it's better to have the natural solutions when possible, but that said, it is still good for bats to have bat boxes up. They're still useful for bats. They can be used as emergency shelter for bats that are displaced by habitat destruction. It can also be used as bachelor pads for those useless males that don't help with childcare. And some species use them as nurseries too, although not all of them around here. So there are many different types of bat houses. There are basically 5 different types, ranging from the very simple and cheap single-chambered bat house to the super expensive bat condos and artificial caves. In general, I recommend the nursery box, which is 4-chambered box. It's the most common thing that you find on the market. You know, that's your kind of your standard bat house. And bat houses are not something you just put up and walk away. If you're going to put up a bat house, make sure that you do your research first, because there are a lot of requirements. And bats are very picky about where they will live, and if you don't get it exactly right, they won't move in. And at worst, it can even be harmful for bats. So the most important consideration is to make sure that it is composed of untreated wood. So wood that doesn't have any pesticides or chemicals in it. These treated wood can be deadly for bats. And if you're buying a bat house online, make sure that it is untreated. Because don't trust vendors to use the right type of wood. Because a lot of them are just trying to make a quick profit and don't really care about how useful their products are. They're just trying to sell something. And so make sure it's untreated, or you could build your own bat house too, in which case you can make sure that you're buying untreated wood. So, and there are lots of other considerations that I don't really have time to get into. Again, you just have to make sure that the construction of the bat house is correct, that they have the right spacing and all that. You have to make sure that it's up high, the bat house is up high and in open location, not in a tree, on a pole or on a building, you know, stuff like that. And there's more resources online. You can see the Bat House Builder's Handbook if you're really interested in this. They provide lots of good resources on how to put up a bat house. And There's a few species around here that use bat houses. Mexican freetails are the most common species around here that use bat houses, but you can also find cave myotis, evening bats, and tricolored bats in bat houses too. And finally, this is kind of my final slide, is one final way to support bat habitat, regardless of how much room you have, even if you don't have any access to the outdoors. This is a way that you can actually provide habitat for bats, is by buying good products. My favorite is bird-friendly coffee. It's certified by the Smithsonian Institute. And although it's bird-friendly coffee, it's really good for all wildlife. It's marketed to birders, and that's why it's called bird-friendly, but it's also really helpful for bats. And it's very sustainable coffee. It's great for wildlife. It's much better than the standard coffee. The standard coffee that you're going to buy from a store is going to be sun-grown and useless for wildlife. But bird-friendly coffee is a great way to help wildlife in the tropics. There's also bat-friendly tequila too, which is really good. And so that is the end of my presentation. At this time, I will be taking questions, and if you, like I said earlier, I have a plant list of suggested plants that we'll probably put up online. There's a link, there'll probably be a link on Hardberger's page somewhere where you can download it, or you can email me if you want a copy. I can also provide this PowerPoint presentation and notes to anybody who wants it in case you just want to view it. But we should have a recording of this presentation online, so you can also download the presentation. So at this point, you can ask questions through the chat. Type your questions in the chat using the chat function, and I guess Teresa can read the questions and I'll do my best to answer.
All right, Kip, that was a great talk. Thank you very much. Let me see here. I'm sifting through the notes or the chat right now. Somebody asked if they put up bat houses, would it be mostly males that inhabit those bat houses?
Yes, it's generally the males. Non-reproductive females too will also use them. And for some species, you do get reproductive females that move in. I can't remember offhand which species may do this, but usually not Mexican freetails to my knowledge, because they generally need caves that are really hot, like 100 degrees. Like Bracken Cave, for example, is the largest bat colony in the world. It's just outside San Antonio, has 20 million Mexican freetail bats, and it is a really cool place if you get to visit it. It's 100 degrees in there, over 100 degrees. It's filled with ammonia at the bottom, so if you walked into the cave, you would suffocate, die, and then get eaten by dermatitis beetles. But so the females need really specific conditions, and so you generally don't get females in the bat boxes, except in the winter. You can get females in the winter in bat boxes. So.
Great, thank you. The next question is, are pesticides that are fogged in the air, do they affect bats?
They have been linked to health problems in bats. In two ways. One, it decreases the number of insects that for bats to eat. And secondly, bats that eat insects that are affected by pesticides can die from the pesticide poisoning. I haven't read about this topic in some time, so I don't really remember any stats on it, but I knew that historically it used to be a big problem and lots of bats died because of it. And I think that they are still being impacted by it today.
Okay, thank you. Somebody said that they have a periphery of their yard is filled with nandina, and is there a trick to killing nandina?
Herbicide. I think herbicide is, you can kind of, if it's young, you can still pull it out of the ground, but once it starts to get its root system in, it's very difficult. For something like that, the other way is by solarizing it, and that's usually a good way if you want to avoid herbicide. So solarization is a way in which if you cut it, you can kind of cut it down, you basically put a big tarp over it. Usually if it's transparent tarp, that's best, but it can also be trash bags, whatever. Put lots of tarps over it and basically nail or cover the sides of the tarp so that it stays down, and that will basically bake it because it will conduct heat inside of there. It'll get really hot and it'll turn any plants that are underneath that tarp into a soup, organic soup. basically killing all of it and making the ground more fertile for plants that you can plant there later. So that's what I'm doing in my backyard. My backyard's been overrun by invasive grasses, so I'm going to be putting down lots of, I'm using painter's plastic. I'm basically putting that all along the backyard to fry all the native plant, all the invasive plants, and then I'm going to be reseeding it with a prairie.
Nice. And we're entering a good time of year to be trying solarization. Here I have, if females and males shelter and migrate separately, when and where do they meet to mate?
So different bats do this in different places. So oftentimes the males, so let's take Old Tunnel State Park, for example. That's a very popular place where you can go to view bats. It's generally you have both males and females in there during the breeding season in spring or in the fall, because some bats mate in the fall, some bats mate in spring, it depends. And they'll usually both, in there you'll have both males and females. And then when it comes time for a female to give birth, the females will move out of Old Tunnel and they'll move to a place like Bracken Cave to give birth. So for Mexican freetails, it's generally within caves or under tunnels and stuff like that. And for tree-dwelling bats, we don't know quite as much about how they come together, the mate, but their echolocation calls travel for quite a distance, so the males will usually project their presence, and the females, if they're receptive, will hear them, and they'll fly over to the tree where the male is, and they'll mate and that type of stuff. And for them, they generally mate in the fall, and then they basically put their pregnancy in dormancy over the winter when they're hibernating.
Very interesting. The next question we have is, because of summer heat, should bat houses be mounted in the shade?
That's a great question. Bats actually like it hot, so they should actually be in the sun. You would think that it'd be too hot for them, but the females, for example, like it over 100 degrees in their roosting colonies, and the males like it similarly hot, so they don't mind the heat. Now, if you have a bat house, I would recommend making it a light color, though. Don't paint it black, because then it'll be too hot for them. That would be enough to probably cook them. Well, they really wouldn't stay in there if it was that hot, but they wouldn't be happy if it was a dark color. But make it a light colored bat house and keep it in a sunny location. And optimally, when we're putting bat houses up, we try to have a diversity of locations. So we might have one bat house that's facing west, where it will get a lot of that afternoon sun, and it'll be very warm. And then I'll usually put one on the opposite side that's facing east, and that house will stay cooler. And that allows bats to kind of choose their preference. So if they're too hot, they can move it over to the cool bat house. And if they're too cold, they can move over to the hot bat house. So that's usually the best way of helping them.
Great, thank you. I have a follow-up question on that. You said that chemicals are to use untreated wood. So if you paint it, is that still a chemical, or is that safe for the bats?
No, as long as it's a safe paint. There's most paints today are like lead-free, and most paints today are made to be safe in case like a toddler eats the paint off of the wall or something like that. So our paints that we use today are safe for the most part, and if it's safe for a person, it's going to be safe for a bat.
Would that be the same for staining it as well?
For staining it, it should be. I think so.
Okay.
I'm not entirely certain on that.
Okay, great. Well, that was the full extent of the questions we've had so far. Thank you so much, Kip. This was a wonderful talk. And to everybody tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciated you joining us on this talk. And if you're interested, please head over to our website and check out what we have at philhardbergerpark.org. Phil Hardberger Park is a donation-based nonprofit that supports activities of the park. And if you're able to, you give $5 or $10, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and everybody have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much, Teresa.
Thank you.